The Simpson Bowles plan, releasing a statement this week on the national debt and a call for action, saying President Trump will inherit enormous fiscal problems, but few are more challenging than the national debt. Mr. Trump will need to show real leadership quickly and decisively to help us climb out of one of the deepest fiscal holes in our history. Our next guests are ready to work with the new administration to reduce the nation's debt. Joining us now, former Senator Judd Gregg, and former governor of New Hampshire, and former Pennsylvania Governor Ed Rendell. They are co-chairs of the bipartisan campaign to fix the debt. Will this be look at you two guys. I'm in between you. I'd like to bring you two guys together about the debt. Is that going to be, are we going to be able to do that, Governor Rendell?
Sure. I think Judd and I see eye to eye about what has to be done. And interestingly, Donald Trump said during the campaign that he wanted to do something about the burgeoning debt, and he blamed President Obama for exploding the debt. But on the other hand, the plans he laid out during the campaign to cut taxes dramatically, cut revenue dramatically, increase spending on military and infrastructure, leaving the merits of those aside, they would explode the debt. Our estimate is it would explode the debt by $5 trillion in the first 10 years, $16 trillion in the second 10 years, and by the end of 10 years, our debt as a percentage of GDP would be over 100%.
Judd?
Well, there are ways to do what he wants to do and still manage the debt, and that's what we want to be helpful on. We've put together a Simpson Bowles 2 plan, which is sort of a proposal, and we've also set up a cafeteria line of ideas on how you can address things like tax reform, which is absolutely critical and should be one of the first things out of the box and can be done in a way that it doesn't affect the debt. In fact, I think tax reform would create massive economic activity, which would actually help us significantly with our debt problems. On the issue of infrastructure, we should pay for some of this expansion. If we're going to start building roads and bridges, which we absolutely should do, we should pay for it, or at least a fair percentage of it, and there are ways to do that that are constructive. So we have ideas which we want to be helpful with, and we're here to be a resource. And to the extent people in his administration or the president-elect himself feels we'd be useful, we're here to be helpful.
Ed, one of the, you know, we don't know what the markets are going to do long term, obviously, but one of the narratives before the election about what you were just talking about, you know, the cutting taxes with infrastructure and what that's going to do to the deficit and to the bond market. It was also supposed to cause a 1,000-point drop in the stock market, and instead we keep hitting new highs day after day after day. I mean, is the narrative that you just painted for what's going to happen to blowing out the deficit, is that any more real than all the scaremongering that we heard before the election if Trump were elected, Ed?
Oh, it's definitely real. You can sit by a calculator and just add it up.
How do you account for the reaction in the financial markets around the world? I mean, we hit all the averages hit all-time highs again yesterday, Governor.
For the life of me, in 7 decades on this earth, I have never been able to account for what the stock market does. Never, ever.
You were head of the DNC, too, weren't you, Governor?
Yes, in 2000.
Do you think Ellison's the right guy this time around? How do you repair what it was supposed to be the other way? The Republican Party was supposed to be in shambles. What would you do now as a pragmatist for your party? Who would you put in DNC? Is he the right guy?
Well, I think the right guy right now is Joe Biden. I would like to see Joe do this. I don't know if he has an interest in doing it. Joe do it for about 2 years and have people like Keith Ellison at the next rung who can generate some, you know, real activity in the states, who can take the case to voters that we have ignored. But I think Joe Biden is the one person who I think could bring the party together. The progressive wing of the party, the left of center wing of the party, and start giving a cogent message to those working class Democrats who abandoned us. Actually, in 12 they abandoned us, and in 16 they abandoned us.
Senator Gregg, when you were watching it and watching what's happened since, I mean, a lot of establishment Republicans, and I'm not saying that that's who you are, but a lot were worried about the down ballot races. When that day was over, or the next day, when you saw what happened, were you just, I mean, what was your response? I mean, there was a tailwind, not a headwind. I mean, it was unbelievable, wasn't it? I mean, your senator, Kelly Ayotte, she didn't back him, and she ended up losing. Those are the only people that, it was bizarre, wasn't it?
It was extraordinary. Kelly didn't lose because of what her positions relative to.
No, it didn't help.
it didn't help, but she lost because 17,000 people voted for somebody else, and we had a huge vote of students that probably don't even live in New Hampshire, and that affected the race. It was a very close race, and she is an exceptional senator. It's a big loss for the state of New Hampshire, in my opinion.
She's doing fine.
But
though.
To get back to your original, to get back to your question, if I could, you know, I think this explosion in optimism relative to the markets is pretty predictable. We've had 8 years of very excessive tax policy, of very excessive regulatory policy. Finally, we've got somebody who's saying, listen, we're going to reduce the regulatory burden, we're going to reduce the tax burden, and we're going to give entrepreneurs and people who want to go out and take a risk and to do that and make some money for themselves and create jobs and economic activity for the country. So I think there's an optimism here. But if you want to predict the one event that could bring this to a to a stop or to a standstill, it is the fact that we're running up deficits and debt at a rate that is not sustainable, and we need to do something about it. And what Ed and I are trying to do is put out bipartisan proposals. And the only way you can address these big issues like tax reform, in my opinion, or entitlement reform, or anything else that's big and affects a lot of people, is to have some bipartisanship. So we're just trying to be constructive here.
Judd, is there any truth to the idea that if we could get above 3% again, and maybe even better than 3% GDP growth, and maybe just, you know, there's no inflation really, or not much around the world, and maybe we could do the world, you know, if there's ever a time not to be a deficit hawk, could it be right now, Ed Rendell?
No.
One of you guys think? No? So you always
I do think we can. I think we can get a 4% rate of growth. I think Donald Trump's right. You can get to 4% rate of growth here.
Can we do that first?
If you put in place,
and then we'd have more money to start doing the other stuff that you're talking about, and then do entitlements, and then do Social Security.
Well, I think the way you get to a 4% rate of growth is you make it clear to the world that we are going to address our long-term fiscal issues, and thus give the world confidence in our currency and in investing here.
That sounds like austerity. And that, you know, that hasn't, you know.
No, actually, Joe, if I can interrupt.
Yep.
Actually, if you look at Simpson-Bowles, of course, had a significant deficit reduction by increasing revenue to the federal government and by making significant cuts in entitlements. But it also said that we needed to go out and spend more money on things like infrastructure. You need to do a balance. You need to do the cuts, but you also need to invest where it's clearly going to help the economy and help create good, well-paying jobs like infrastructure. That's something I think we all agree on. It doesn't always have to be all federal government money. It can be private sector, it can be states and localities, but we better invest in some of our own growth soon.
Gentlemen, governors, thank you, and Senator Gregg, and best of Mrs. Gregg. We told you, Judd, but